I Love Black People Radio on HUR Voices, Sirius XM, Channel 141. I Love Black People is more than a radio show. I Love Black People is a call from our ancestors to protect us from racial profiling all across the world. Go to iloveblackpeople.com and become a member today. Membership empowers you to live fearlessly and protect Black people globally from racism and xenophobia. Join us today and become a member of our global network with an online global green book with Black-owned and Black-friendly businesses to protect you and your community. Membership is free, and with you, we will become 10 million strong worldwide. I am because we are. Special thanks to AFLAC for supporting I Love Black People Radio.
And welcome to another edition of I Love Black People. And I'm just so pleased to have you here sharing this moment. I'm currently in Zimbabwe, so I'm traveling and loving to share this amazing opportunity with all our listeners and prayerfully, it'll inspire you to come to Zimbabwe and experience it for yourself. And some of you may not know, as much as I Love Black People is a radio show, we actually have a tech startup, I Love Black People, in our office. One of our offices is actually in Zimbabwe, in Harare. And Harare is the capital of Zimbabwe, and they have a Harare International Conference Center. And our office is located there. It's I Love Black People. So from there, our team, really deals with the tech stuff that we do as far as building this global safety net to protect Black people from racism and xenophobia. So literally, it's the brains of our operation. Even though we're remote, we have staff in Kigali, Rwanda, Nairobi, Kenya, Johannesburg, South Africa, of course, these United States. And the time I've spent here, as always, is a great opportunity. Of course, if y'all don't know, below the equator, the seasons are reversed. So it's summertime when it's wintertime in the United States. And Zimbabwe has an interesting climate. I know a lot of people think about Africa, and you never think about people wearing coats or hoodies and skull caps. But I was in for my first trip. I came with shorts on and tank top, and I thought and this was in August, which is their winter, and I froze my behind off. And it's Zimbabwe and even South Africa. Southern Africa has a climate that's more temperate. It's not as tropical. There's certain parts that are more tropical, like a Masiatunya, the smoke that thunders, which is what they call Victoria Falls. And I don't call it Victoria Falls. Victoria was literally a mass murderer and a person who perpetrated mass human rights violations. The things that she did in her time of existence definitely is up there with some of the worst of all types of leaders. So they call it a lot of things with Victoria's name in it in Africa, but that's not a sign of honor. It's really a sign of what was done, unfortunately, to so many indigenous people. But with that being said, Victoria Falls, we call it Masiatunya, the smoke that thunders. That was the local name. And I think that's probably more compelling. So it's a waterfall, and it's so huge. And then the sound of the water is so amazing that it sounds like smoke that's thundering. So that's the name of it. And it's tropical there. But one of the reasons why the colonizers decided to settle in Zimbabwe was because of this climate. It wasn't a high amount of mosquitoes with the malaria. The weather was more kind of mild. And so they literally tried to depopulate Zimbabwe and repopulate it with Europeans. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about is something that kind of pains me when I'm in Zimbabwe, and I really feel bad about, is U.S. sanctions against Zimbabwe. So many of you may not know, but the country of Zimbabwe, like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries, have sanctions. And I remember telling one of my family members that Zimbabwe had sanctions, and the first thing they said is, "What did they do to us? What did they do to the United States?" And of course, she was thinking about like North Korea, like there's somebody trying to blow up the world, or things like that. And I said, no, there's probably never been a recorded incident where an indigenous, a Shona or Ndebele, and those are the two major ethnic groups here, that have ever done anything to harm or to hurt a U.S. citizen. Yet the U.S. government has had sanctions on Zimbabwe now for over 20 years. And, the real thing is that, if you really look at Africa, none of the revolutions or liberation movements that took place in Africa were supported by the United States. These are just facts. I don't want that to be true. I want to say that half of them were supported by the United States. The truth is, the United States actually supported the colonizer and the ruling class that controlled the colonial systems in Africa. Even when we talk about South Africa, and people always laud Mandela, and rightfully so. But let's be clear: the ANC, the African National Congress, was actually an outlaw terrorist organization that Reagan had said was a terrorist organization. So when we're looking at the history of the United States role, and that's not, again, even when we talk about United States was a colony, and it was a colony that the local government decided they no longer wanted to be a colony. But what they did was they subjugated the indigenous people and created what they call a settler colony, where it was literally the United States is controlled by people from another place, the Europeans. So if you go back to the North America 1,000 years ago, the people look very different. Just like if you go back to Egypt, the Arabs that came after the indigenous African people were very different. You go back, 2,000 years, Egypt was a very different looking place. Well, these were the things that were being done here in Zimbabwe, just like with Australia. And one of the things that happened after they got their independence was that they were promised their land to be returned. And there was a process called the Lancaster House Agreement, where they actually agreed that, look, and this is when Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF, which is the current ruling party, they literally went to armed struggle. Many African countries did not get their independence with armed struggle, outright conflict. Some of them were negotiated without that. But in Zimbabwe's case, it was a long, protracted struggle, and they didn't get their independence until 1980. And if those who are aware that most countries got their independence in the 60s, soon after World War II. A lot of times we don't talk about how conflicts amongst Europeans can oftentimes lead to opportunities for the indigenous people. Even if you look at the war in the United States, the so-called Civil War, where two groups of Europeans fought, which saw at the end of that, when Black people got involved with one side of that war, where there was, again, the end of enslavement formally, as well as a host of other changes that took place. So when you see some of these crises in the world, like you see now with the Ukraine and Russia and NATO with a proxy war, these oftentimes are opportunities. One of the things that I've been here in Zimbabwe, where farmers were talking about growing wheat. So many countries were importing wheat because it was cheaper from the Ukraine or Russia. But with the onset of this war, it's made the prices very expensive, and it's really made many of the farmers awaken to the fact that it's important that possibly to actually grow wheat and export it. So again, when there's a crisis, again, we wouldn't say, if the folks who've been whooping us say they sick, we shouldn't say we sick. We should probably be like, yeah, you sick, and now I got an opportunity to do the things that I need to do to get myself better and out of this situation. So I think in the many things that we've seen with Zimbabwe, it's definitely a great insight into U.S. foreign policy. So once they got the independence, 1980, 10 years later, they were supposed to be able to, the United States and the UK agreed to help compensate the people for the land that was taken because of colonialism. Again, many of us know in the US, we're talking about reparations and how do we get back the sacrifices of our ancestors. Well, one of the things that Zimbabwe was one of the only countries to do, said, look, we're gonna get our land back. It's not just that we want to have a free country, free of colonialism. The things that you guys took, we're going to get those things back. Now, unfortunately, the the UK and the United States reneged in 1990 on the agreement. And some people even say that they asked Robert Mugabe not to make a big deal of the reneging of it because in 1990, that's the precursor for Mandela to come back, and they were looking to end apartheid, and they didn't want. There was not consensus, but there have been many people, leader in key positions in this part of the world in Southern Africa, said, "Look, if you guys make a big deal or rise up or continue conflict, it's going to make it more difficult for us to get our apartheid to end in South Africa." So with that being said, the 1990 came by and went when they were supposed to get the money to give the white farmers who had taken, and they call them farmers, but let me just tell you, I've been all over Southern Africa. The people doing the farming were Black people. It's just like going to Southern, into the United States doing slavery and calling those folks white farmers. They were landowners. Those were land gentry. They weren't farmers. The people actually doing the farming were actually Black folks on those plantations, and the people actually doing the farming in Zimbabwe were the Black folks who come from this region of the world, who understand what it takes to actually grow on this land. So in a real way, the people who actually were the farmers were actually the Black folks, and the folks who actually just were the landowners were the European colonizers, the so-called Rhodesians. So in a real way, as we talk about this, it's a story that oftentimes, if you don't understand the context or the language, it's easy for it to be manipulated, so that we don't really understand who are the true protagonists in this situation and who are the people who are actually causing the oppression. So with that being said, looking at the situation, 1990 comes, and of course 94 with Nelson Mandela and ANC, they get their independence. Mandela's president. They came back and said, look, the soldiers, these are the people who actually were involved in the military conflict with the Rhodesians. And remember, Zimbabwe was one of the first countries besides Mozambique, with Michel, as well as in Angola. These were some of the first to actually defeat the European in armed combat. So it's a big deal. Like the Rhodesians secretly had the support of the United States. Supposedly they were supposed to be, not trading arms with the Rhodesians, but behind the scenes, the United States, even Henry Kissinger had visited. Like they literally were working with the Rhodesians and were defeated on the battlefield. And they were literally had more tanks, they had more helicopters, they had airplanes, and the Zimbabweans had nightfall and a blade and defeated these folks on the battlefield, and they still mad. And I think sometimes we don't even think about how, we talk about never forget, to this day, there's Civil War reenactments. Like the Civil War took place in 1865, it ended, and there's still people going out dressing up every summer or whenever the dates are, and full regalia from a treasonous group that actually lost, and actually they never forget. Well, the same thing in the context of Zimbabwe. They defeated these Europeans on the battlefield, but still that memory of having control of that land and control over the people and resources is not been forgotten. So as much as when they started saying, hey, the soldiers from the Zimbabwean side, the actual part of the liberation struggle, they said, look, we were promised our land back. Like this wasn't just for people to actually now sit at the lunch counter together and sing Kumbaya. There's consequences of winning a war. And one of those things was we would get our land back. There was a consequence for the people who lost their lives. And instead of just trying to use diplomacy, the fact that they went to war was a sign that said, look, we need this change now. And if we're going to fight and willing to have folks give up their children, their sons and daughters to a war for our liberation, then we should make sure that those who made that sacrifice be worth something bigger than just a political gesture. So Throughout that whole point, the UK, no one agreed. US would not agree to the compensation they had agreed to with the Lancaster House Agreement, and like 19 in the 2000, like around 2000, many of the people who fought, they call them war veterans, started occupying the farms. Now, again, we talk about Occupy Wall Street, where folks were occupying in front of Wall Street and in parks. These folks were literally occupying the farms of the land that was stolen, taken away from their ancestors. And I even had somebody, and this was actually a indigenous Zimbabwean, tell me, well, they didn't just take the land. The chiefs back then signed the land away with a big X on a contract. And I had to say to this person, now look, I do business in Zimbabwe. I can't do business based on US laws. So I have to do business based on the local laws. And there was no local laws or customs or traditions in that region of the world where people controlled land that way. So there's no way somebody can say somebody gave away something with an X. These are, again, more of the ways where people try to like confuse the history by taking facts out of context, or taking words that may represent one thing to one group of people but may not have no context in for another folks as it relates to land ownership. In many indigenous spaces, including North America, people didn't see ownership of land that way. They almost saw our existence as trustees. Like, we can't own air. Like, you can't sell your air to someone. It's literally a part of the earth. We're just here to be stewards of it. And then when we move on, then we leave it to those who come behind us. It's not something to be bought and sold. So again, with that being said, these farmers, these war veterans actually took over the farms, and there was a big push by the British government to tell the president at that time, Robert Mugabe, to send in the army to go get them out. And to be candid, many times in these developing countries, when they're told something like that by these so-called superpowers, world powers, they do it because, as you know, many leaders in Africa have been killed by coups. They said about 9 coups in the last decade. The militaries that overthrew the governments were trained by the United States, by AFRICOM. So the consequence is not just, a tongue lashing by a diplomat from another country. The consequences could be, a bad night where someone comes in and blows your brains out. And these are things I'm not saying that are making up. But you can look at the history in Liberia, Patrice Lumumba in the so-called Congo at the time. Like, these are things that have happened because of leaders not agreeing to what is being done, being told to be done in order to appease those powers. And I think John Perkins, we've had him speak. He wrote a book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where again they talk about how the U.S. government will send diplomats or these type of people to speak with leaders and tell them what they need to do. And if they give them financial incentives and whatnot, but if they refuse the incentives, they then send in, they call them the jackals. So there's economic hitmen, and there's the jackals. And jackals are the ones who are the mercenaries, or the people who bring in, a plane that crashes. Samora Machel in Mozambique, they actually moved a beacon for an airplane, and actually his airplane crashed into a ground in South Africa. So there's so many things that have happened to African leaders when they don't do what they're told by the former colonial masters. But in this case, Robert Mugabe did something so brilliant. I mean, again, he was a brilliant leader. And instead of calling in the army to come in and physically or forcefully remove the veterans, he called the parliament in session, and they literally passed a law called the Fast Track Land Reform. And I think the Occupy Wall Street people wish they could have thought of this, but they literally made it legal. They changed the law and actually made it legal to occupy the land like the war veterans had. And he called it the Fast Track Land Reform. So that was a brilliant, way of using governance in order to support the people's will and interests. That being said, that type of nationalism or concern for your country did not, of course, go well with the United States and the UK. And I think in another session, we'll talk about how the Cold War had kind of made that different. During the Cold War, there was not just the United States and the UK, there was the Soviet Union. And so in some cases, developing countries could actually seek support from one side and use that to leverage against the other side. And we're starting to see some of that now when the world is no longer unipolar, where there's just one group, but now there's seems like that is changing. Like NATO is not the only power structure, because now China and Russia have exercised their level of military power. And again, I'm not into anybody getting killed. With that being said, the UK and US was upset, and they actually started the sanction process, and they levied these sanctions against the country. So out of retaliation for what was done with the land reform to return land that had been agreed to, but then was reneged by the UK and US, the actual people who were the ones who had fought in the war said, look, send them the land, we're going to make the land come back. And there's also been people who said, well, the land went typically to more of the, more influential veterans and people who were connected to the party. And I think, that's some of that is probably true. Politics is, it is what it is. And I've seen it close up in the United States. But I will say, if we really want to just keep things in context, when George Washington in the United States defeated the British, the people who ended up with the land that the British had controlled, the companies that were from England, the people who supported the British monarchy, those lands were taken and given to George Washington's friends. George Washington was one of the largest landowners even before the war, and after the war, even a bigger landholder, holder of land. And so there was even rebellions from some of the soldiers that they had been promised that if they had left their farm to take up arms, that they would be compensated with land of their own or additional, resources, and they didn't get them. So, when there is a war and someone loses, there are consequences. And I'm not saying that in support of that. I'm just giving context that, again, when I hear people analyze Africa, I don't think it's heaven and that is being ran by, Jesus. I think these are real people and there's real situations. So that being said, the people were able to get the land back, but what they did with the sanctions, everybody who had taken the land back, they were now under sanctions. And the same crops that were grown on that land the year before now were no longer, they almost did it like how they do blood diamonds. One of the things that you would think, the blood diamonds is about the diamonds that are in conflict or war. Well, who's to say what conflict is what conflict? And what it ends up happening, it's the same colonial powers that use these designations in order to control markets. So there's never been a consequence for the United States invading Iraq where they call something blood something, or Afghanistan or Libya. Like there's so many invasions that have taken place, unfortunately. But in this case, they said you can't sell whatever goods from that farm because you're part of the sanctions. And it's called like the OFAC sanctions. This is from the U.S. Treasury Department. But literally, this is what started to happen. And the people who might have been growing bananas one year, the best bananas, they weren't able to sell. With that being done, it became a long protracted. And what people don't realize about sanctions, they're not meant to help anybody. What the United States said, this is about democracy. The hypocrisy is crazy. You hear something about human rights, and some of the countries that the United States supports so much, like Saudi Arabia, if the United States government was so serious about human rights, it wouldn't be involved in so many wars that actually end human life and that don't leave countries better off, but actually worse. And in so doing, there's resources taken and whatnot. So it's clear that the issue has never been about human life. It's more about control over resources. And with that being said, some of the issues that we see it's now fast forward is 20 years of these same sanctions. And I've even had people say, oh, they call them targeted sanctions because it's just targeted to people who did something wrong. Now, first of all, there's a thing called sovereignty. At the end of the day, just like when something happens in the United States, another country doesn't have the right, the Russians don't have the right to do something to the United States because of a policy or something that happened. Well, the same thing's true for African nations. They're sovereign nations. So it's not up to the United States to dictate how they're governed. If they don't want to have a democracy at all, if they want to be communists, or if they want to be like the UAE or Qatar, they can have a monarchy. So with that being said, definitely, thank you for joining me. Thank you for those who've considered about coming to Zimbabwe. Please take the time to research. Don't just take the words that I say. Again, the question is more important than the answer. So please have question all of these things. But in the end of the day, take action. Have your agenda and take action in it. And as I always leave this wonderful opportunity to share with you, I am because we are, and I definitely wouldn't be me without you. Thank you so much.
This is I Love Black People Radio on HUR Voices, Sirius XM, channel 141. I Love Black People is more than a radio show. I Love Black People is a call from our ancestors to protect us from racial profiling all across the world. Go to iloveblackpeople.com and become a member today. Membership empowers you to live fearlessly and protect Black people globally from racism and xenophobia. Join us today and become a member of our global network with an online global green book with Black-owned and Black-friendly businesses to protect you and your community. Membership is free, and with you,